Support for Nevada Week is provided by Senator William H. Hernstat, Cashman Equipment, De Castroverde Law Group, Valley Electric Association, and additional supporting sponsors.
Hello and welcome to Nevada Week. I'm your host, Casey Smith. Thank you very much for joining us. Well, if you still have questions or are confused about what question 3 is all about, you are not alone. Many viewers asked us to dig deeper into what it could mean if Nevada passes the proposed constitutional amendment known as the Energy Choice Initiative. Voters will decide that come November. Now, because of those requests and because we want to do a more thorough analysis of this issue, we're going to vary from our usual format of hearing from both sides of the issue and dig deeper into how question 3 could affect our budgets and our way of life if it does pass. To do that, we have enlisted the aid, once again, of Meredith Levine, the Director of Economic Policy for the Guinn Center. She is the author of the unbiased and independent study that examines how deregulating utilities has played out in other states that have tried it. Also joining us is Nancy Bruin, the Executive Director of the Guinn Center. Now, we want to point out that both Meredith and Nancy are neutral parties in this discussion, as is the Guinn Center. Our discussion will focus on what could happen based on the Guinn Center analysis if question 3 passes. Now, if question 3 is not approved by voters, then nothing changes. So, Meredith, welcome back. Nancy, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
The first question actually is, tell us about the Guinn Center a little bit, the mission of it, and how it's involved in issues like question 3.
So the Guinn Center is a statewide bipartisan policy institute. Our founding board members stood up the Guinn Center with the goal of providing data-driven, independent analysis to decision makers on really complicated policy challenges that the decision makers and the voters have to consider here in Nevada and the Intermountain West. Energy is a very complicated issue, and so it makes sense that we would weigh in on something like this. I will say that in the past few years, we've done voter guides and fact sheets on all the ballot initiatives that voters will consider. And for that reason, we're not taking a position because this report falls in that category of voter guides and fact sheets on the ballot initiatives. In many of our other reports, we do actually offer recommendations that decision makers and legislators should consider.
This is an extremely complex issue. And once we get deeper into this, I think a lot of people are going to understand why it's logical that you can't take a position because uncertainty is probably the name of the game here, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, Meredith. So you mentioned on our last show, okay, that yes on question 3 would mean a new type of life for us electrically wise, I should say. Now, can you explain in layman terms what a yes vote would mean? Because no clearly means nothing changes.
Right. So a yes vote would actually mean, as I said previously, that there would be a new type of business model or market model in the state. So were question number 3 to pass, we would move from the current utility system, which serves about 90% of Nevada's customers, and that's a natural monopoly. And then the generation portion would actually be open to supply. So what that would mean would be retail electric energy choice for Nevadans, the businesses, and for residents alike.
One of the operative phrases would be open market, free market, correct?
That is accurate in terms of the fact that there would be market that would, or a retail electric market. However, that doesn't mean that it would be an unregulated market.
Okay, we're going to touch on regulations in a little while, but okay, the statistics tell us, okay, we're told that Nevadans pay about 4% on average less than the national average for electricity. So what they want to know really is if question 3 passes, will their bills go down? And what does your analysis of the other states that have dealt with this tell you? Will it go down or do we know?
Well, that's the real question here, is that will it go down? And that is exactly what consumers want to know. And what we have found is that we have no way of telling them. And the reason for that is when you look at the experience in other states, there's been a lot of movement depending on how the market was designed, what time period we're looking at in the restructuring process, et cetera. And so what you do know is that there's an effect of wholesale electric costs that tend to affect pricing. How those move around in a restructured market will affect what the consumer ultimately would see in the electric bill at the end, but then there are also regulatory costs and things of that nature that go into electric bills. So will it go down, will it go up? We don't have the answer because we don't know what, in Nevada, where especially we're heavily invested in natural gas, we don't know what natural gas prices would look like in 5 years.
And natural gas being the main component in the generation of electricity, right?
In Nevada, correct.
Okay, so the rates for natural gas right now are at or near historic lows. And it's a commodity. And in commodities traded, as we know, there can be wild swings. Right now, they've found a lot of new pockets of natural gas in areas like Wyoming, and it really, right now, it's a stable market, correct? Right?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. But if instability enters into that, how much would it affect the price of the generation of electricity, and would that be passed on to consumers if question 3 passes?
So it gets a little complicated here. So here's the bottom line. The way it works is that wholesale electric prices, whether the market is restructured or not, do get passed on to consumers. So for example, if someone is a consumer of the monopoly utility right now, which is NV Energy, and there's a wholesale increase, they might take a rate case to the regulator. At that point, the wholesale price would get passed down with no profit taken for the incumbent utility. However, in a restructured market, the way it would work is there are different participants in the market, and should natural gas price, or should they go up, ultimately there's a bidding process that happens every day and every hour even within the market, and that can affect the clearing price of natural gas, and then there's profit that can be taken on top of it. So it does lend, again, the nature of natural gas as a commodity does lend a bit to the uncertainty of the question, but then also the process within the markets does have an effect as well.
So Nancy, uncertainty, volatility, whatever you want to call it, according to your study, what has been put in place in some of the other states of study, particularly maybe Texas, because we've used that model in the last program, and both sides actually use it as a kind of the poster child for their point of view. What steps have been taken in other markets to try to at least mitigate the volatility?
Mm-hmm. So what we found in our analysis is that 22 states have considered restructuring or have restructured. 7 states later repealed it. But in all of those states except one, being Maine, the government had, or the states had to implement rate caps, rate freezes to protect consumers, to stabilize prices, and to facilitate the smooth transition to a restructured market. So experience shows that we would likely have to, should question 3 pass, we might have to consider ways to protect consumers from some of the volatility and market volatility.
Now, the unique thing about our question 3 is it will be a constitutional amendment if it passes. And that has not been the case in any other state, correct?
That is correct.
Mm-hmm.
So if we need rate caps, if it is so determined that that is what happens down the line, where does that come from? Who decides what is capped, how much, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
A really great question, because we did look at the legislation of the other jurisdictions that went to retail electric choice, and what we found there in particular was that really depending on the state, it was how much they entrusted the utility regulator in the state to either have a broad scope of authority or a narrow scope. So in some states, the public utility regulator was actually given a lot of leeway in terms of setting those rate caps, although they were, they're left out of another piece of this, but they had a pretty strong role. And in other cases, the state established through legislation what the rate cap or reduction or freeze might look like.
Here in Nevada, we have the Public Utilities Commission, which right now controls the electrical rates. As we talked to John Wellinghoff in the last show, the PUC would be involved in setting the ground rules, basically, but apparently, and you would know this, and the main question is, would they have any effect on rates?
They would not. So that is the way that works, is that because of how energy ultimately trades in a restructured market, you're going to something called an organized wholesale market. And that gets a little bit complicated, but effectively what happens there is that comes under the jurisdiction of the body that Mr. Wellinghoff was formerly chair of, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. That is a federal, they don't even set rates at retail, but they have oversight on the rates in the wholesale, organized wholesale markets. The PUCN, the Public Utilities Commission of Nevada, would actually no longer have the ability to control rates. They might have other authority and even additional regulations depending on how the legislature decides to implement this. But it wouldn't mean that they would have any control over the rates because it suddenly becomes more of a federal matter.
So is it fair to say that if question 3 passes, there's no body that actually controls the rates? It's a calculated risk on the part of the voters and the consumers. That being said, the rates can go down. I mean, in a free market, I mean, it's very possible that the rates will actually go down and not up. For what amount of time, nobody knows. But so it's not doom and gloom. It's just like I said, it's uncertainty, correct?
It's uncertainty, that is correct. And what I would say is about FERC is that they do have some authority over wholesale electric pricing. So while they can't control sales at retail, that would be where the individuals or businesses purchase, they do have control there. So there are controls in place to, I guess, put safeguards against market manipulation. And so what you do see is that, yeah, prices can come up, prices can come down, but it is a market. And that's a real distinction between what we have now.
I do want to add, we keep referring to the last show that we did. You can go to vegaspbs.org, click on the page for Nevada Week, and you can see all the shows that we've done, not just on this topic, but all of the shows. And so if you want to hear more of what we said in the last show, that would be great. Now, I got to bring this up because we've had a lot of viewers ask questions about this, and let's go to California. Back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, there were rolling blackouts, there were brownouts, and the operative phrase is the Enron scandal, okay? And what that was market manipulation by some of the players in this type of proposed market under question 3. So in your study, how have states dealt with that? Because there was a lot of rear view thinking, if you will, after that happened, and a lot of states have implemented at least some regulations to keep that from happening again, right?
Okay, so what I would say is there are 2 pieces to this. One is that the Enron scandal is not quite relevant here in terms of the fact of brownouts and blackouts and things of that nature. And the reason is that blackouts and brownouts are still possible regardless of market model. Plants can go offline.
So the people who were worried about that issue needn't. Is that what you're saying?
Not necessarily need. I mean, we always need to worry about these issues as a general rule. Again, we saw in Nevada recently that there was an outage. So there always can be the possibility of outages regardless of model for the very simple reason that weather.
Well, exactly. Some of them are natural disasters,
some of them, right. Okay,
back in the day were manipulated.
Exactly.
Right.
So then if you want to look at the market manipulation, there are rules in place that now deal with that and really try to, again, offer a safeguard or guardrails, if you will, against that. What you saw, for example, back in Illinois in, I want to say 2007, was that some of the affiliated retailers did some stuff around market manipulation, and it ultimately translated into $1 billion of rate relief for citizens or residents, of Illinois. And so what you do see is that there are correctives that can be put into place if these things should occur.
Can I just add, though, to that point? I mean, this is a really complicated process. It's the regulation of energy. And so we've seen in a lot of states that states have intervened to regulate or to, intervene to facilitate the full transition to a retail electric choice market. And so in Michigan, for example, in 1 year, they passed 40 regulatory orders. Other states passed a dozen regulatory orders. So I just wanted to remind folks that this is a very complicated process, and we've seen that, governments actually sort of intervene more, right, to make sure it may not be manipulation, but it's just a very complicated regulatory process.
So when you say they passed, you're talking about the state legislatures in these particular states, right?
Or the
governing
Public
body,
Utilities
like Public Utilities
Commission,
or the Public Service Commission, I believe, in New York. So getting back to, and we're going to touch on implementation for a minute and then come back to it later, but this is all at the the responsibility for all this would be the state legislature here, right? Okay. They'll have 3 sessions to do this. I believe the deadline is July 1st, 2023, if it passes, okay? So look, forward thinking, how can they try to do this and not have to go back like Michigan has had to do and like Texas has to do and some of these other states have had to do? I mean, and there's always the unintended consequences that happen in legislation, and sometimes you just can't foresee problems. But given the fact that there have been 22 states that have tried this, do you see this working well through the legislature, or is this going to be an ongoing process?
Well, Meredith, you can jump in, but our view of the research and the experience of other states is that it is an ongoing process. So I know we're going to talk about Texas, but looking even at Pennsylvania or Texas, right, this has taken 15 to 20 years. So it's a really complicated issue, and there's a lot of potential for volatility and requires stabilization, intervention, and so it will be a long process should voters pass question 3.
And Texas is interesting because I believe some 85% of the state is unregulated, but there's still some that is regulated. And as you said on the last show, that for a while the unregulated prices were actually lower, and then it's kind of evened out. Is that correct?
So I guess the number is 90-10 on the choice and non-choice areas, but that's sort of a marginal question. I think that the larger question is what happened to rates in Texas. So there's actually conflicting evidence. And so it's not only that there is this idea that they're kind of converging so much as there's really very different evidence depending on how the data was modeled to show that the rates have improved in Texas in these areas or the rates have disimproved in these areas. And it's very inconclusive when you do look at that.
At this point, NV Energy controls the generation, let me get this straight, the generation, the transmission, the distribution, and then the retail, okay? Should question 3 pass, NV Energy has said that it will probably pull out of the market completely. If maybe not completely, but certainly out of the retail part, possibly out of the generation part. They may or may not own the lines. It's nobody's quite sure, but it's possible. If they do, then there will be different companies that will be in charge of each part of this process. Will there be extra fees tacked on, let's say, because the middlemen in each situation will want to get their profit, and so will that lead to higher prices, or is that something that will be regulated, or is that something that we don't need to worry about?
So let me put some clarity around what actually might happen pursuant to the initiative petition should this pass. So the first thing is that it says is that there can't be the granting of monopolies for generation services. So what that theoretically means is we understood it in our report was to say that generation would open itself up to competition, and then NV Energy is on record saying that it is willing to still be the quote-unquote wires company, and that's the transmission and distribution portion. So NV Energy, under our assumption, doesn't disappear. Okay, so now we're on the generation side, and you have these competitive suppliers, but you actually have something else, which is in the organized wholesale market, you have the folks that purchased the supplies. Now, there's a term called divestiture. I think we're going to talk about that. This would mean that NV Energy would have to sell its assets. Right. Does the initiative petition require that? It does not. However, the idea is we're going to build a competitive market. And if you build a competitive market, you don't want the previous monopoly to hold the assets. So the idea is that it makes sense for them to sell. So now you have the owners of the generation assets and you have the suppliers that interface between the wholesale market and the end-use customer. At each stage, there can be profit maximization. Okay,
so it may or may not be an issue. It's a free market economy.
It's a free market.
So it could be lower. I mean, that's the other thing that we need to point out. I mean, because this is hopefully going to work out whichever way this works out for the best. Okay, choice. Let's go on to choice, because that's another issue that we brought up in the last show. And Mr. Wellinghoff says there will be choice if you live here and you want Company A, next door neighbor wants Company B, it'll be fine. With respect to your study, and whichever state you want to use, we've used Texas a lot, there could be a large amount of choices, couldn't there?
Yeah, so Texas has over 200 different providers. If you go to the website, you can choose among 200 different providers. But again, Texas, that process took 16 years. We've seen actually in some states where they implemented a rate cap, a rate freeze, or some sort of regulatory policy, you didn't actually see the competition or new competitive suppliers come in because those interventions were holding the market or prices artificially low, so that discouraged competitive suppliers from coming into the market. And so again, it depends. I think the real benefit or whether there's sort of an ROI on this will depend on how well we actually design and think about the restructuring process.
And that is up to the legislature once again, right?
Yes.
And would that be a bid process, or do we know yet?
I don't think we know that yet. I think that's, again, something that the legislature will have to think about.
Okay, one of the other viewer questions was, if we get into the situation and there's multiple suppliers and everything, will there be a penalty for wanting to change companies? Much like we'll use the analogy of cell phone service. If you want to change carriers on a cell phone service, sometimes you have to pay a penalty to get out of your contract. Would that be the case here? Is that the case in other
What
states?
we've seen is oftentimes a person will not be able to switch suppliers until they pay their current bill in full. And so, I think we've seen penalties or consumer complaints around how easy it is for consumers to move suppliers once they've signed up with a supplier.
Have there been in the other states some type of program for low-income people, the people who are having issues with affording energy in the first place? I mean, there's a program here.
Right.
But in a free market, is that possible, or is that just a monopoly situation?
It's not impossible. So again, it comes back to the implementation question, and it really depends on the state. So some states, again, when you look at, let me go back to a little bit of what Nancy said. So if you look at those contracts, for example, some states have put in some protections around this idea of not being able to exit a contract, for example. Other states, it's very much read your contract. Okay, and it's the same thing sort of with low-income households. Some states have put in robust programs to ensure that low-income households have done okay or not been penalized under the market. Other states have not. There was a recent case out of Massachusetts where there was a sense that low-income households were getting scammed, and so the AG did bring some action on that.
Okay, real quickly, I need to ask a question because people are asking renewables. Do renewables figure into this? Because there's no language in the question about renewables.
So here's where it gets really interesting. So actually, the initiative petition does have a slight bit about renewables, but not in the way that people think. What it says is that the laws that the legislature passes should not in any way be understood, or the amendment itself should not be understood in any way to undermine policies regarding renewables in the state. However, the problem is that we don't know, because the Constitution supersedes what is in statute. And so because of that, we really don't know. It leaves kind of a vague interpretive area for people to really think about what could happen with renewables. And so Assemblyman Brooks, if viewers check back to the last show, discussed that in length. And so
to encapsulate this whole thing, because we're running out of time here, and it's such a convoluted subject, we're talking about free choice here. We're talking about a market situation if question 3 passes that can work either way. I mean, the operative word is uncertainty, but it has worked in other states, correct?
It depends what you mean by work. So,
okay.
Right, okay, so again, in terms of has a market flourished for choice? You could say that in Texas, yes, a market has flourished for choice. There's 200 some suppliers. You could say, was this a very easy, simplified process? No, you could look at Pennsylvania and say it took 16 years. So depending on the dimension of the question is really the nature of the answer.
So it all comes down to how well the legislature organizes this. Is that correct?
I think that's right.
Okay. One more question really quickly. A lot of commercials, a ton of commercials on this subject. Meredith, when you watch these commercials, is there anything that sticks out to you that is absolutely correct or absolutely incorrect?
So there is one thing that does stand out to me as absolutely incorrect, and it really is what Nancy started out talking about, which is the guarantee on rates. Your rates will go down, your rates will go up, your electricity bill will go down, your electricity bill will go up, and we just don't know the end.
We just don't know.
Yeah,
Okay,
we don't
and
know.
we're going to have to end it there because that's, I guess, the thesis here is we just don't know yet, do we? Okay, there we go. We'd like to thank our guests once again, Meredith Levine, Director of Economic Policy for the Guinn Center, and Nancy Brune, the Executive Director of the Guinn Center. Now, if you'd like to learn more about what we've talked about, go to vegaspbs.org. And if you have a question or a topic you'd like us to explore, please email us at nevadaweek@vegaspbs.org. That's it for this edition of Nevada Week. I am Casey Smith, and thank you very much for spending part of your Nevada Week with us. We'll see you next time.